We can start when. Give us some. Go ahead and talk.
Good morning. Great to have everybody on board today. We're going to get going here and start with a few introductions. We can see your questions that pop up, so just a few administrative things as we go through. I'll take some natural pauses so that you can get questions in, which I hope you have, and this is more of a discussion than Rick and I having a one-way communication here. So please feel free to type your questions in, and we will answer those as we go through the presentation. So no need to wait till the end of the presentation. My name's Sean Barker. I'm the Associate Director here at the Shingo Institute. I work with assessment and with the curriculum and with the operations of the Institute. And I've got Rick here with me. I'll have him introduce himself.
Sure, I'm Rick Hedgman. I'm the Research Director here at the Shingo Institute, and then work in a couple of departments at a couple of universities in Denmark as well. So a lot of my emphasis is on technology development and innovation in relation to things like lean and quality management more broadly.
So we've got about between 30 and 45 minutes here to go through this presentation that we've set up, and I hope that it's some great information for you, and that from the questions that we get, we even dive deeper into some of the things you might be have interest in or concern about. But let's go ahead and start off. So the first thing I want to make sure people understand is sometimes because we have changed our name in the past, we used to be called the Shingo Prize, but I want people to know where everything actually resides. We are part of the John M. Huntsman School of Business at Utah State University, and we are here in Logan actually right now speaking to you. The Shingo Institute has always been part of the Huntsman School of Business since its inception in 1988, and the Shingo Prize is the award that we assess to and we give out of the Shingo Institute. So just so kind of everybody gets that context in there.
Yeah, and just to give a little historical context, what that essentially means is that the Shingo Prize was established concurrently with the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award in the U.S. and a few years ahead of the EFQM Excellence Award in Europe.
Yeah, exactly, Rick. That's exactly right. And so we do several functions here, one of which is the prize and the whole assessment side of the prize and all of the research that goes along with that. And then we also do some research. That's what Rick is in charge of, and that incorporates publications. We also have an insight product that many of you might be familiar with. It's our online assessment, and we can address that if there's any questions to that. And then we also work with the curriculum on workshops, which are distributed through our affiliates. So let's talk about the model just a little bit, just to give people context around the insights that I'm going to be talking about. Most of what we do here centers around our model and discovering new things about the model and researching these connections. But the model articulates how these work together, how systems work with principles, and how systems work with the culture, and how tools support the systems, all of which to deliver results. And if you notice when you look at the model, you'll see that each one of these has its place, and each one of them is important. So when we talk about the behavioral side of things, that is never to diminish the importance of the tools or the importance of the culture or the systems or the results. Because in the end, we've got to deliver results, and we're all about delivering those results. So when you look at this and you look at how these all impact the culture, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today, and those are the descriptors in those arrows. We'll talk about specifically what those mean as we go through this presentation. The principles, as you can see, are up on the top, and many of you know, if you've read our model, that we divide these into 4 dimensions. The important thing to remember is that although we talk about these separately, they all work together. It's very difficult to isolate a system that only works with one principle, or a principle that doesn't react with other principles. So to keep those in mind, we've divided them into 4 dimensions, and that's really for ease of understanding and ease of being able to present the material.
Sure, and just to give you maybe a little bit of contrast with some of the other things that you may have seen out there, if you're familiar with, let's say, the Baldrige Award or the AFQM Excellence Award, there are some distinctions between those and what we do at Shingo. One of the things that we do at Shingo is we emphasize the behaviors much more. So if you look at culture as the way we do things around here, as the collection of behaviors in the organization, the reality is that those behaviors are what eventually produce results. And so we focus more on behaviors, relatively speaking, than you would see in some of the other systems. Beyond that, we focus a little bit more on, let's say, lean as an approach to excellence than would, say, the Baldrige or the EFQM, which are a little bit more agnostic. And beyond that, we also focus a little bit more at the plant level or the divisional level than you would see, let's say with Baldrige or EFQM, where they tend to be more at the enterprise or division level. So we get down to the nitty-gritty and really try to assist organizations exactly where they're at.
And that's an important distinction, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So I see, Roxy, you've got a question on here about the arrows versus the little triangles. The little triangles are simply there to show that all of these impact cultures, and you're trying to build a culture of operational excellence that delivers the results that you want. And results, or in this case, how we measure things, actually has an impact on culture, or in a more in-depth term, on the behaviors, because all of those behaviors are what make up our culture. So that's a great question. So that's what those triangles are there for, is just to say that they all impact, they all exert pressure on culture, right? The question, of course, is how, and how do we make that pressure the appropriate kind of pressure so that our culture grows in the direction that we want it to grow into. The arrows describe the relationship between each one of these. So as we look at principles, for example, and this is sometimes a difficult concept to understand, probably because of the way we describe it more than anything else, but when we talk about principles, we're actually talking about the ideal behaviors that are informed by those principles, because that's how you actually see principles. You see them through these ideal behaviors. So when we talk about systems being aligned to principles, it's systems driving closer and closer toward that ideal behavior that we talk about in the principles. That's how principles make sense to us. So when you talk about flow and pull value, it only makes sense to us if we can see the behaviors behind that. So the description is one way, or the definition of flow and pull value is one way of beginning to understand some of those behaviors. And then we have some other things that we use in that. But getting down to the systems level and understanding the behaviors that those systems are driving becomes of critical importance. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But thank you, Roxy. That was a great question.
Yeah, Sean, for just a minute, could you comment on what we really mean when we say ideal behaviors? Because we don't want those of you that are listening to mistake those for perfection.
Exactly. And we're going to talk about that. I will, Rick, and we're going to talk about that in 2 slides. So let me get to that in just one moment, because that's actually one of our key insights. So as you can see, call it the triangle, gets broken down even further. So the dimensions get broken down a little bit further. And we look at this, when we look at the cultural side of things, to us, that's, you could look at that as people and process and purpose, if you were to kind of go up and look at each one of those dimensions. Everything driving toward creating value for the customer, as it should, and that's where all of our efforts should be aligned to. So when we're measuring results, and this is when we talk about, measure the results that matter, we're trying to measure those results, and I believe all organizations are trying to do this, are we measuring the results that are most critical to our customers, and what their expectations are from us?
Sure, and one of the things that I would also comment on here is that when you see these principles, remember that you're only saying a couple word description on each one of them, so that the way that we talk about these things internally could be a little bit different than the few words that you see on the slide. There's just a couple examples of that. When we talk about creating constancy of purpose, more or less what we really mean is unity of purpose and a shared vision. When we talk about, in the continuous improvement category, we talk about embrace scientific thinking. And we really mean embrace scientific thinking and critical thinking. So it isn't just the experimentation part or the observation part, it's being able to mentally work your way through that and see what the real meaning is and what the implications are for those changes that you're making. And we could go through other examples if we went through all of those principles, but you're only looking at a few words. There's much more behind each one of these.
That is a critical point, Rick, and you can get a little bit more in depth if you download the model. Some of these things that Rick talked about are available in the model. So let me just give you kind of just another little nugget to take what Rick was saying, and I'll take it just a step further. When we look at the behaviors behind what he was talking about, unity of purpose, right? We're not only looking at the things like vision and mission, and these, not to say they're not important. I want to know what the emotional connection is that people have to the existence of their organization. What is it that ties you all together emotionally to the vision and mission of your organization? And sometimes that's different. Sometimes it's close to what your mission is. It depends. It depends on the organization, and it depends on the culture. So that might give you a little bit of insight into what we're going to talk about next as we begin to talk about our first insight. But so this is available to you. These slides will also be made available to you. Dom will make those available to you after this broadcast. And you can also, of course, download the model, and I believe real close to this image that we have up here, and the model itself. So please feel free to do that, and please ask us if you need help with any other materials like that.
Yeah, and when Sean says download the model, he really means not just the model, but the entire model booklet.
That's correct.
So that it provides much greater information than we can possibly share with you in 45 or so minutes.
Yeah, and I might just add to that, Rick, that's a good point. You can download the guidelines as well. And the guidelines, although those guidelines are designed for organizations that challenge, they give us another look into what some of the things are that examiners look for, and another look into what some of these behaviors are. So, of course, all of our workshops are designed around this and how to really take you in depth. I mean, we only have so many minutes here to disseminate this type of information, and there's a lot to talk about.
Well, that's right, because one of the things about it is that obviously we like to be able to acknowledge organizations that really excel. With things like the Shingo Prize, or there are 2 levels beneath that. But the real prize isn't the Shingo Prize, and all of you know that. The real prize is that your organization performs at superior levels. And we want to better enable that if we're able to help you with that.
Great distinction. And it really is. That is the prize for us. When we talk about those type of things here, it's about getting the results that you're after and being able to make those results sustainable. And because they're sustainable, they're also predictable. So those are some of the things that we talk about here. So let's begin to look at the insights that we've discovered over the years. The first one, to get back to Rick's point earlier, about ideal results require ideal behavior. Right? So when you think about this, or think about it kind of like you would think about value stream mapping. You have a current state and you have a future state that you want to work toward. That future state also invokes an ideal state, right? So what is the ideal state? Because by understanding what that ideal behavior is, it allows us to go in, assess our systems, and be able to say, well, we know our behavior is here currently, but where do we want to take it? Where's the right place to move it to make our results even more sustainable and more predictable? Now, as Rick alluded to earlier, ideal results doesn't mean perfect, right? It doesn't mean that necessarily, because to be honest, in every industry, try to think to yourself, what is the perfect result? That's quite difficult to think about when you talk, especially as you break that down. It might be easy in the case of on-time delivery, for example, right? But let's look at that closely for just a moment. Does 100% on-time delivery, is that the ideal? It is, numerically speaking, but it also depends on how we're getting that 100% on-time delivery. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at an organization that might deliver any type of product, but let's talk about a product for a moment that it delivers to its client. And let's say the client calls in and wants an order. How quickly do you think that client wants that order? Well, if it's me, I want it yesterday, because I just discovered that I need it today. My need was actually yesterday. Right? So if we think about that and then think about how we actually work that order within our organization, sometimes in some organizations, and we've been into many, you look at that and you go, once the customer orders that, then we look at what our capabilities are or what our lead time is to get them that order, and then we work with them on a delivery date that we can get them that order. And what do we measure to? We measure to that agreed upon delivery date. Well, 100% on-time delivery to that date is good. I'm not saying that it's not, but is it ideal? Not really, if you think about it from the customer's perspective. They wanted that order a long time ago, right? So these are the types of things that I'm talking about when we talk about ideal behaviors and ideal results, meaning that even if you're at 100% on-time delivery, we can still probably improve, because we can cut down that lead time. We can look at the behaviors that we're talking about a little bit differently and even get better for delivering value to the customer. And so when you look at that, these are the types of things that we're talking about. So in order to get those ideal results, we have to understand what that really is, right? What the customer really wants or needs. And that's not always easy, because sometimes as customers, we don't know what we want or need. But it's that in-depth understanding of what the customer wants that continually drives that ideal, right? And you may change that ideal result. The better you get and the more you understand your systems and processes, you move that. We all do that, right? As we look at that. We never take results or behaviors from here to here, right? They both work in steps, but we have to know what the end looks like in order to be able to continually drive that and know that our path is actually headed toward the end in mind.
Well, that's right. And sort of the idea behind ideal results, ideal behaviors, and so on is that whatever is ideal today probably isn't going to still be ideal tomorrow. I kind of think about it this way, that status quo is Latin for the mess we're in. Status quo won't do because your competition doesn't stand still.
That's right. That's a great way to look at it, right? So keep those in mind when we're talking about that. That's the first insight. The second insight is about the systems. Systems drive behavior. Our deep understanding of those principles and the ideal behaviors that we want enables us to build these systems and drive them toward that behavior that we want. Again, steps at a time, because these steps begin to indicate we can only move as fast as the maturity of our organization moves with us. So what does that mean? So we can only move based on the capability and the abilities of our organization to move that system. We have to build that maturity into our organization to move, and that's why we can't go from here to here. Now, as we develop that capability and that capacity within our organization, can we move faster? Absolutely, and that's our intent. How do we get you to be able to move more rapidly toward some of these ideal behaviors and ideal results that we're talking about? So building systems is critical. Understanding how to build those systems is critical.
And it's hard work.
And it is hard work. And frankly, that's why a lot of people aren't on this journey. It is hard work, and it's hard to understand. The interesting thing, though, when I say they're not on this journey, I don't think I've ever spoken to an organization when asked about their continuous improvement and how do they continually improve, that no organization has ever told me that they don't have a system for doing that. So somehow, some way, people are leading themselves to improvement. You have to, as an organization, to survive in a competitive environment, you have to do this. And so organizations are doing it. The question is it structured with a structured understanding of how to do it and what drives those?
Well, that's exactly right. And one of the things that I would say is that sometimes organizations have blinders on just as individuals do. To give you just sort of a view of that, in the US, there are 2 major college entrance exams for potential university students. And on one of those, they ask students to do sort of a self-rating. 90% of students taking that exam rate themselves in the top 10%. And so one of the things that's really important is not just to understand yourself internally, but have sort of that external frame of reference that allows you to gauge how it is that you're really doing compared to world class or best in class or something of that sort. Because we need to know that if we're really going to advance. And that's one of the purposes behind everything that the Shingo Institute does, is to enable you to have not only that internal frame of reference, but to develop a better external frame of reference as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So now if we look back at this, right, and we talk about from an assessment perspective, because you're always assessing your organizations. I know most of you have some type of assessment you're doing with your organization. And if it's not formal, it's certainly informal, because we all do this. What do we look at? Mm-hmm. Well, we begin to go back and look at the behaviors and say, what behaviors do we see, observe, or see evidence of? And then we begin to look back and say, is this coming from a system, or is this coming from an individual? Is it a good behavior or a bad behavior? Because remember, the way we actually look and measure behaviors measures behaviors. And in reality, the system can be used to measure good behaviors or bad behaviors. And why is that important? Well, if we have some behaviors that we don't want in the organization, understanding the maturity of that behavior begins to give us the ability to understand how much effort it's going to take to remove it. Mm-hmm. And how much we're going to have to intervene to remove the behavior that we don't want. Because we're always trying to eliminate the behaviors that we don't want, mm-hmm, and increase the behaviors that we do want through the designs of our systems. So if you think about it in that perspective, it begins to give you some idea of the assessment methodology that we talk about. We won't have time to cover all that today. I wish we could, but that's one of the things that we talk about in our workshops.
Sean, can you take a stab at that question from Tim Fisher?
Oh, sure. Sorry, Tim, didn't see that up there. That's actually very small on our screens, so let me look at that before I go on to the next one. It says, we're debating what a system really is. Can you provide? It's a great, what a great question. So a system, as we talk about it, all right, and And the debate, please understand, we used to get a lot of people that would be concerned about, are we talking about a tool, are we talking about a system, and all that. That's less helpful than just understanding that a system, it has a common purpose. All the tools in the system have a common purpose. And it's not just the tools, right? But it's the complex interaction sometimes between all of these tools. But they have a common purpose that they're driving towards. So let's look at this from a natural perspective, right? So I have a system in my body that's my pulmonary system, right? That pumps my blood throughout my system, right? And there's a lot of tools in there. There's my heart, there's my lungs, right? There's a lot of other things that purify the blood. I'm in this, but they're all toward one purpose, and that's circulating this through my body to give me life, right? Let's look at it a little bit differently, because your question is good, because you get into subsystems too, right? If we look at an automobile, we can say, okay, an automobile is a system actually made up of a lot of different systems, right? So when we begin to break that down, we see, oh, actually in the automobile, there's an HVAC system, right? That's tied to a lot of the other systems through a computer system, all designed to make this automobile comfortable for the driver, right? So it's tied into these other systems, but it has a specific person or purpose to keep that vehicle at the desired temperature for the driver, right? So there's a lot of tools that go into play in that, through looking at the entire air conditioning system and heating system and how they work together. A lot of people don't actually understand that your air conditioning system is actually critical in the wintertime also, because it takes moisture out of the vehicle. There's things like this, how they interact to drive that. So it should be, so if you look at a system versus a tool, there's also a way of which we think about that when you look at the system. So there's a maturity to it. So let's look at that for just a brief moment. Sorry, Tim, but when you ask me a question, I can take a long time to answer a short question. I hope I'm not taking this too far. But let's look at something when we talk about it in the world of the tools of lean or operational excellence, or whatever you'd like to call it, right? So when you look at this and you look at 5S, well, 5S, I look at it, and you can look at it as tools from a tool perspective at its maturity level, or from a systems perspective, right? A system, to me, right, and to the way we talk about it, would be closed loop, meaning it continually improves itself. It has a feedback system in place to be able to continually improve itself. That makes it quite different from a tool, because a tool is usually used at a point solution. You have a problem, you bring in a tool, it solves your problem, and on you go, right? So when I talked about 5S, right, what do we usually see in 5S? Well, we usually see straighten and sort and clean. That's about it, right? In many cases, not in all, in many cases. So those are two tools that are used, and they're important, but the system as a whole still has standardize and sustain, right? And it continually assesses itself, because the system evolves and changes over time. That's what makes it different than a tool. Tools don't normally do that. So I hope that makes sense. Go ahead, Rick.
It does. I was going to ask you maybe to take a look at John Ellis's question, which is related to that. So just in case all of you can't see it, John says, systems, the instantiation of a process, don't both the process and the implementation drive behavior in the possible combinations of good and bad processes and systems?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. They do. And I mean, tools are this critical part of the systems, right? So yeah, absolutely. They do drive behaviors. They're a part of that system. So when you look at actually changing a system, right, after you've assessed it, let's say, and you say, this system isn't moving us toward this specific behavior, right? You begin to break that down and look at the tools. What tools do we need to add to this system, or maybe take away from this system, to be able to eliminate a behavior or drive closer to a behavior that we desire? So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, now we have a really interesting question, and this is for you. You're the expert, Sean. It's from
Oh,
Martin.
how should
Yeah.
you measure behaviors? This is an interesting one.
We have,
You're not even allowing me to get into our last insight. But let me try and do this quickly,
Well-
even though this is a
well,
long.
Sean, I must say, Martine is asking that question. Must be writing to us from the UK, or somebody who uses UK English. We see your spelling on behaviors.
So let me answer that, right? Because what's critical in this discussion is understanding what those key behaviors are. We call those key behavioral indicators, right? So as you look at ideal behaviors, what are the key behavioral indicators that tell you that those behaviors are going in the right direction, right? Sometimes these can be measured by a metric, right? But sometimes they can't. So when you're looking at that behavior, or sometimes the evidence that that behavior is happening, it's a binary measurement, right? It's either it is happening or it isn't happening. And then we actually have and you can download this, it's part of the guidelines that I talked about. It's the behavioral maturity scale. So if you look at the behavioral maturity scale, then you're looking at how frequent is this behavior. So it's about frequency, intensity, duration, scope, and role, right? Frequency, how often does it happen, right? Duration, how long has it been happening? Intensity is about whether it happens regardless of what our environment is doing to us or not. A good example of that is, do we continue our training even when we are all of a sudden strapped with peak performance? We're 100% capacity. Are we still just as involved with training people as we were when we were not? Now, that may vary in degree, right? But the question is, do we just eliminate it? I was with an organization that when it became busy and all that, guess what happened? First thing that was cut was training, right? That's not intense, right? And then we have scope. Is it through the entire organization or the entire organization that we're assessing, looking at from your perspective, right? Is it within, are you looking at just a department? Are you looking at an entire facility? What are you looking at, right? So the scope of that, and then who is performing that behavior, right? So there's quite a few things I've thrown in there, and I know that gets complex in a hurry. But it's the only way I have to kind of answer that question in a brief.
Sure. Well, part of the idea behind maturity scales, essentially, we get older. Just because we get older doesn't mean we get better. And so with maturity scales, what you're trying to do is take something soft, a behavior, and make it more solid. And so a lot of times those maturity scales are descriptive in nature. They say if you're really moving from a 1 to a 2, what does a 1 look like? What does a 2 look like? And it may be helpful, depending on the sorts of behaviors you're looking at in your organization, to try and develop something on, say, a 1 to 5 or a 1 to 10 scale or something like that, and say, okay, here's what we know a 1 looks like. That's not so great, but just graduate. Step up the ladder.
So, Jose, you've got a great question, too, on how many metrics or behaviors are ideal. That's a great question, because the truth of the matter is you can only focus on so many. So true enough, you may assess more than you're actually focused on, right? And the reason I say that is because even though you may be only trying to move, let's say, between 5 and 6 of these critical behaviors, and this is again why it's very important to know what the key behaviors are. But if you're only trying to move 5 or 6 of those, you still may be assessing 10 or 12, because you want to make sure that the ones you have moved don't deteriorate and they sustain, right? So we're always assessing more than we're probably looking at moving, but that is a critical decision within your organization, and it's based again back on the maturity of the organization. So the capacity and the capability of the organization, or the maturity within that culture to be able to do this. Some cultures can deal with more than others because they are much more mature, and they have some others that are already sustained that are giving them that ability to do that. So it's not an easy answer to that one for any given organization. It is an easy answer to say you can't have too many. And what begins to look like too many is when there's just a lot of measures or behaviors. So regardless of what we're trying to look at, that we're trying to move, that none of them become important. It's like having too many priorities.
Absolutely.
Right? When every priority, and you know how to sense this, you all look at this within your own organizations. When everything is a priority, is anything a priority? It's not. That's what begins to happen. No different than when you look at measures, right? We want to focus on the key few that are going to really drive it. Let me go to this last point, and then we'll address questions, because that's most of what we'll have time left for. So the last point, or the last insight here, is that principles inform ideal behaviors. And what that means is the deeper we understand the principle, the deeper we understand what those ideal behaviors are, because remember, principles drive consequences as well. There are consequences for adhering to ideal behaviors, and there are consequences for not doing that. And that's another large discussion, but principles have consequences tied to them, and we want to understand those so that we know which one of those behaviors that we want to drive to, and which are key behavioral indicators. And that's part of the discussion that we get in depth into when you look at our workshops. Our Discover workshop kind of drives you through the whole methodology of how this all works with key behavioral indicators and KPIs and how those tie together. But it also begins to look at the assessment of that. The other workshops drive deeply into the principles and how they inform these ideal behaviors. So those are really the key insights. Again, those are all available to you, and we'll make this presentation available to you as well. Let me just look at these questions real quick. We've got one from Patrick here. Back to systems. This is kind of a long question, so bear with me here, Patrick.
It says, I was under the understanding that systems are business systems, like a feedback system, strategic planning system, problem-solving system, etc., not a lean method, concept, or tool. Am I looking at this wrong?
No, I don't think you're looking at it wrong. Actually, there's different kinds of systems, right? There's business systems, there's improvement systems, there's work systems, right? So there's all different types of systems. So when we look at those systems, I don't think you're looking at that wrong at all. Actually, all of these types of systems are apparent and in organizations, whether you're on a lean journey or not. They're there. The question is, are they designed to drive the behaviors that we want? Meaning that I can, by designing these systems properly, I can begin to shape the culture that I want. Right? So through all of these systems that you're talking about. So I don't think you're looking at them wrong at all. I think this may give you a new way of looking at them, because we're looking at the behaviors that the systems are producing as well as the results that they're producing. And we want both. And the reason we want both is because if you want results to be sustainable, and by sustainable, I mean that they're on the trend that we want them to be on, they're highly predictable, because they're on this trend that we want them moving on. If you want that, can you get that in the short term with poor behavior? Absolutely. There's all kinds of examples of that. How we drive great sales results, for example, with bad behavior that actually impact our customer long term and will hurt us if we continue to do that behavior. But short term, does it work? Absolutely. But that's not the kind of system we want to design, right? We want to design the system so that we continually get those results over the long term by delivering the kind of value that the customer expects. So no, I don't think you're looking at that incorrectly at all. We just break those, when we talk about them, up into the different categories of systems when we're talking about business systems and improvement systems. Do they interrelate? Absolutely, as they should in any organization. They all work together, just as all the principles do. But we can look at them that way to be able to begin to really define them and what we're looking at.
Well, and I think as maybe sort of a complementary comment on that is while Shingo more greatly emphasizes lean than some of the alternative approaches that are out there, if you look at the principles, most of the principles are not quote unquote lean principles. It's hard to say that lead with humility is a lean principle. It's a human principle. Or respect every individual, or some of the other things. So think systemically. Well, that's not a lean principle, but it certainly supports lean implementation and some others. So, not everything that we do is about lean per se. It's about culture. It's about behaviors. It's about all sorts of things, not just how we arrive at excellence.
Yeah, absolutely. Boy, I can tell you, I want to commend you all. Your questions have been fantastic today, and that's due to, of course, your prior commitment to understanding some of the things that we've done. We had a question from Christine here that I think was just a little bit earlier, so I'm going to scroll up there just a touch. But yeah, so Christine, you asked about our systems also value streams, and value streams I think have a lot of systems in them, right? They've got a lot of work systems in them. They certainly are impacted by business systems and improvement systems and all of that. So are they a system themselves? I guess you might be able to perceive it that way. It depends on, if they have all the characteristics of one where you've got your closed loop built into there, but they're going to have a lot of subsystems in there that are shared between the different value streams in an organization, right? That are all driving toward producing, or they all have the purpose of producing a specific value for the customer, right? So.
And Christian, you had another question. Have you ever conducted a relations diagram to assess key behaviors, the drive behaviors you see? I may just be unfamiliar with what you mean by relations diagram, and so I can't really comment on that.
Yeah, well, let me comment on that briefly. Actually, that was the one I saw just before we got on to the one about value streams and that. So I would actually turn that question around, Christine, if I were to ask it and say, are value streams systems? Rather than saying our systems value streams, right? Our value stream systems, and that to me gives a little bit different connotation in my mind. So in the relationship diagram, so one of the things we do, and actually we provide this in some of our workshops, and that is getting to this point that you're talking about, or what are some of those key behavioral indicators? How do they tie back to systems, and how do those systems then tie back to what we call behavioral benchmarks and to the principles? So actually we do some of that work without being redundant on the do there, but we begin to talk about that because we get in depth in that discussion in Enable, Improve, and Align. So we have this actually on a large spreadsheet that we work on to begin to link all of those together. And I think that's beginning to get at the question that you're talking about. The other thing that we do is in our Insight product that you heard me talk about just briefly, which is really how we gather data for some of the research that we're doing. We look at how the behaviors link to those systems when we're doing some of the Insight surveys that we do. So we do get into that. I don't know if it's to the level that you're talking about, but certainly that is one of the critical parts of our research, because in the end, our end game for the research is how closely can we tie results, not only correlated, but we'd love to have causation, right? Results to behaviors, because then I would be able to come back and tell you exactly what you're talking about, and that is, if I move this behavior to this degree or this much closer to the ideal, what is it going to do to results, and which results are we talking about? That's what we're looking at, because that to us is the golden nugget in all of this research.
Absolutely. Lots of good questions coming so quickly that we might not be able to address them all. Steve, you like enable better than drive. I don't disagree with you. I use the word enable a lot. On the other hand, I think drive is just more of a power word.
Yeah, and we're talking about a behavior. So yeah, so you could say it better enables that behavior. That's true. There's, I don't think there's anything incorrect about saying that. Uh, what we want in the system, to your point on enable, right? Just like tools enable the systems, right? They create some of these relationships and some of these results that we're talking about that are delivered by the system. We also want to make sure that the system, it makes it easier to act in the direction that we want people to act, because of course that is the behavior, is the action. We want people to act, to make it easier to act in that direction than it is to do something else, than it is to do what we would call a workaround.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so I don't think there's anything, certainly that word doesn't worry me at all, if you use that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Patrick, I see your question on, you're still confused about insight number 3. Well,
Okay, inform.
yeah, maybe just sort of a decent illustration is if you look at one of the principles, respect every individual. Well, if that is one of the principles, then is the behavior of backbiting, is that something that is consistent with that principle? So if you really reinforce the principles in your organization, then backbiting is something that hopefully goes away or is not well tolerated.
Yeah. So let me take that just a step deeper also, to kind of add to that. And I'll stay with Rick's example of respect every individual. So if you go and read the definition of respect every individual out of the model, and that, it's going to make sense to you, and it's going to make sense to you from a business case perspective. Meaning that if I respect every individual, then there's certain business consequences to that. True enough. That's absolutely true. And those are some of the consequences that we want to look at when we're building systems and we're talking about ideal behaviors, right? But what I say next may take you to a different level. The reason that respecting every individual is important, and the reason that it is one of the principles, is because when we look at people from the human side of things, every person has unlimited potential. Every person has unlimited potential, right? It's only driven by our expectations of what that person can do. So now when I say that, how does that change what you think about respecting every individual? How does that change how you think ideal behavior might be? If I'm only looking at ideal behaviors from a business perspective, I tend to lose that human side of things. So, for example, so how does that change things? Well, if I look at that and for example, I'm looking at my development of people. If I look at it from a business perspective, and Rick and I are trying to decide how we're going to develop people, we're going to say, well, we want to do this, and we want this person to take these type of classes. We want them to become Six Sigma certified because we want them to do this for us in our business. True enough, it's a great decision, and we do need that, right? But if I look at it from the deeper side of things, and somebody comes to me and says, I want to get my bachelor's degree. Okay. What if Rick and I go, gee, the position that we have them in doesn't really require a bachelor's degree. Our business decision would likely be, that doesn't support us, so we can't really see a business reason for why we'd want to do that. On the other side, when you talk about potential, and you talk about how we, through our expectations, can help with that potential, unleashing that potential is what we want to do. Rick and I have no idea about the type of potential that we're going to unleash within that person by allowing them to develop themselves with deeper knowledge and understanding of not something specific to our needs as a business, but something in general, and that changes the decision that we might make, or should change the decision that we make, right? About how we develop people and how we develop their understanding and their potential as an individual. Could they leave us? Absolutely. They might leave us, in fact, because we might not have a job that we can put them into. Is that okay? That's okay.
Well, there are enough Americans here, and some of you may be baseball fans, that you would recognize this former commentator, television commentator named Joe Garagiola. And I recall listening to him say one time, and he was making a point very strongly, that he thought the worst thing that you could say about someone, a player, was that they had potential, because to him that meant that they weren't realizing everything that they were really capable of, potentially that they were holding back. So the idea behind this potential and unleashing it is for us to be facilitators of people accomplishing what they're truly able of accomplishing, and mapping that not only to how that betters their circumstances, but how that works in favor of the organization.
So I hope that by defining that principle a little bit deeper, it's actually not even a definition. We call it something different. But by understanding that principle deeper and deeper, it changes the way we think about what the ideal ought to be. Now, again, are we always going to be able to attain that ideal? No. Will we move closer to it? Hopefully, yes. Will it drive different behaviors? Absolutely. And will we get different results? Yes, that is the intent. So if you think about them in that light, that's why principles inform. It informs our understanding of the principle better, so that we can better see what these ideal behaviors are. And by the way, we're always learning. Keep that in mind. We're always learning about these ideal behaviors. This model, I can tell you, will not stay constant through time. We changed it in 2008. We talk about different things that we want to do to it all the time. As with everything you do in your organization, our model should be evolving as well when we learn new things that can take you closer and closer toward these ideal behaviors and ideal results. And we intend to do that, and that, again, is where our research moves us towards as we look at these things. It's been great talking to everybody today. I think we're about out of time.
We're close, but Sean, there are a couple other important slides, at least from our side.
Yeah, there are. So let me get on to those just briefly, and hopefully we'll have just a moment to talk with you before we wrap everything up.
Yeah, and by the way, when Sean says we're always learning, sometimes we're learning how wrong we were.
Yeah,
so
sometimes.
Don't take everything we say as gospel by any means. In fact, we have a lot to learn, just like everybody else.
So as you look at this last slide that I just brought up, is the principles drive enterprise excellence, right? And so when we look at this, when we look at enterprise excellence and in our minds define this, we're looking at this balance between KPIs, or your results, and behaviors, or what we call KBIs. And we want to make sure we're looking at both of those. And if you look at this bridge just below that, usually you'll see organizations that's very common to start out with the tools driving the results, because we need to get results. And in many cases, we need to get them quickly. So it's not an unusual place for organizations to start. And as they begin building this bridge from one side, the side that sometimes gets not enough attention is the principles and the behavioral side of this bridge, which helps us drive towards enterprise excellence. And the way it does it, the way it closes that gap that's in the middle of this bridge, is through those systems that we design and build. That's how we operationalize it, is we build those systems to drive the behaviors that we want, to sustain those results over time, to continually mature our organizations and be able to drive closer and closer toward those. So this is how we look at operational excellence through the lens of the model and through the lens of the Shingo Institute as we talk about these things. So we're constantly trying to make sure that our bridge is solid across the middle here. Again, if I could put one more diagram up here, it would be those systems right in the middle of that bridge that kind of ties all of this together to be able to drive those results that we want. So this is actually a slide that you'll get because it begins to talk about insight and where to go so that you can get a little bit more information on insight and how that assesses your organization. Again, that's a internal view of how you're doing toward the model.
It's fundamentally a product that we have available here in our portfolio at the Shingo Institute.
Yeah, absolutely. As is the assessment that we do for the prize. This is a third-party look as opposed to the insight, which is an internal look at our organization. This is a third-party view or assessment of our organization. And of course, these will be the awards that we're giving out at our conference that's in Orlando this April. But these are the types of things that we've just talked about that you're going to hear at our conference from organizations that are working with the model and working with this type of methodology to drive their organizations toward operational excellence. So whether you're just beginning this or whether you're at what we call in one of our tracks a master's level or higher, we try to design the conference so that it meets everybody's level of where they are in this process so that it can help them drive them to a better and better understanding of the model and methodology that we've just talked about. So this is a chance to do it, great chance to network with people.
Yeah, I would like to make one point. Sean, could we go back just one slide?
Absolutely.
When you're looking at the prize, and Sean is talking about assessment, there's a reality. We talk about that as being something in our product portfolio, but on the other hand, I think it's important for you to know that that's not a revenue stream for us. That's something where people go out and actually look at the company and provide expert feedback. And yes, the company pays for their transportation or things of that sort, but it's not a moneymaker. It is out there purely to help organizations improve.
Yeah, and I mean, I could talk about this. This is one of the things that falls under my responsibility. I could talk about this at length because it touches on the assessment that we talked about. It touches on the model. It touches on the education. But these are a group of experts and individuals that have been trained in our methodology and go out and give of their time, and their organizations give of their time for them to go out and do this. And what a tremendous opportunity for them as well as for the organizations that they're assessing. And usually these are 3-day assessments where they go into the organization and begin to look for these things that we've talked about through this whole discussion. So it's a great opportunity for an organization to learn some things about where they thought they did have strengths and where they thought they might have opportunities that they didn't see, and expose some of those gaps that they can begin to work on to close. So yeah, you're absolutely right, Rick. We could talk about this for another hour.
Well, that's right. And Sean, there's one more slide. Since we have some participation from Ireland,
that's right.
There it is.
So if you're interested in going on a study tour, this is one that we have coming up. And some of the things that we do a little bit different on our study tours, we do talk about the model, and we give an overview of the model, and we have some more of these in-depth discussions with some of these great questions that you all have brought up. But then we go to organizations that are actually doing this, right? We go to some of the recipient organizations so that you can begin to ask them questions. You can get into their systems. You can talk with their folks. You can tour their organization and begin to network and understand how they approached this as well. Because frankly, a lot of approaches are different. Organizations are different. Cultures are different. All of those things. So your approach will likely be a version of, or you will adapt something into your organization that works. But this gives you a great opportunity to do that.
And we hold other study tours
As well.
annually. So Ireland
That's
just
true.
happens to be the next one coming up.
So it's been great talking with everybody. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So Rick and I actually have another meeting coming up here in just a few moments. But you have this slide to be able to contact us. And so please use us as a resource. We hope to be talking to you later. We do these webinars from time to time. If you have an idea or would like a webinar that addressed a specific topic, please let us know. And we'll try to develop that so that we can, again, get into more depth to some of your questions and that. We only, of course, have so much time to do that. They are available through our workshops. They are available through our study tours, as Rick has said, and at the conferences. We do several conferences, too. That was, again, just one of them coming up.
That's right.
So please let us know. We're happy to help. That's what we're here to do. And it's been great talking with you all today.
So thanks very much. Hopefully you got something out of it. And if you have follow-up questions, you can see our emails. Feel free, don't be shy, hit us up. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care.